Hi, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to Series 7 of the Climate Pioneers Show. This series, we are focused on my personal favourite topic, hiring and building great teams. Hiring the right people, is the most important thing that you will do as a founder. And how you build out that early stage team in your business is crucial because it sets the foundation upon which everything else will grow. And throughout the course of this series, I'm speaking to founders, investors, coaches, and specialists from across the full spectrum of HR and talent, giving you access to valuable insights and advice as you build your team. And today, I'm delighted to be joined by Parul Singh, founder of Parallel Minds, a neurodiversity consultancy on a mission to build a brighter future for people in tech. Parul began her career working in technology recruitment and consistently acted as a champion for the tech community, helping people to level up their careers, advocate for themselves, and build networks of like-minded people. She worked as a neurodiversity lead for a well-known tech consultancy and launched the Tech Rise Manchester community 2 years ago, which is a valuable support network for people in tech. Parul herself was diagnosed with ADHD in 2021 and autism 3 years later. She navigated the challenges of managing her condition in the workplace and seeing the challenges that other people face. She set up her own consultancy. So her mission is both an authentic and a deeply personal one. And I can't wait to hear more about her journey and share these learnings with our community. Thank you so much for joining me, Parul.
Thank you so much. That was genuinely one of the nicest introductions I think I have ever had. I think that's sometimes the hardest part when people are like, can you send a blurb about yourself? So I might actually steal that when people are like, can you write something? Because it was so, you know what, I couldn't have said it like better myself. And I really appreciate you inviting me on today, obviously to be able to share some of like my personal experiences. But given the nature of like the audience and the people who are like watching, like the chances are, I mean, being a founder, it's quite common for neurodivergent people, particularly people with like ADHD or both autistic and ADHD as well. So you might learn something from like a professional perspective, but maybe something about yourself personally too.
Absolutely. I really hope so. Well, thank you so much for joining me. And I'm happy to send you that intro, actually.
That would be great. Yeah, I'm gonna steal that one.
So first of all, tell us about your own personal journey, because that is so central to all of this. What was your journey to both of your diagnoses, and also what kind of prompted you to pursue that diagnosis?
Yeah, so there's a lot to that sort of like journey. So I will try to condense it a bit. And then, of course, if there's anything else you do want to know. Starting my career in agency tech recruitment, obviously it's very chaotic. It's very sort of like varied. It's very like fast paced. And naturally, I just quite enjoyed that. Like I was like, this is where I thrive. I actually did my degree in chemistry. And I remember being bored out of my mind in the labs. I just sitting there watching something titrate and like, oh, it's just so dull. And I was like, I can't do this. So it did make sense that I gravitated towards that. But a few years into my career, and it was during COVID time, actually, I just completely like hit a wall. I was so like burnt out, but to an extreme where like absolutely nothing was working. You know, I was trying to do all of like the mental health stuff, all of the well-being things. I tried every productivity technique that you could think of, and nothing was working. And there was something telling me like, there's just something not right here. I had been diagnosed with anxiety and depression, and I was on antidepressants, but the pieces just weren't fitting together for me. I was like, there's something else at play. And it was actually when I was attending a tech meetup, but virtually. And there was somebody on there talking about neurodiversity, and she's talking about ADHD, and the penny just dropped. Her name's Rachel Morgan Trimmer, and she's just been she was the catalyst to my journey. The morning after that, and I've still got the screenshot of the request I sent to my GP, literally like 12 hours later, putting my request in, and then I got referred, and it was NHS, but I managed to get my diagnosis within a few months, and I started medication not long after. The journey to my autism diagnosis, quite interestingly, there is quite a bit of an overlap. I think it's something like 60 to 80% of autistic people are also like ADHD. So if you have one, it might be worth looking into like the other, because chances are you got both. And usually people don't have that much of a gap. But again, like being a woman who can, like, as you can clearly see, is like, I don't have like really obvious challenges with like communication. I'm a people person. That's what I built my career around. So it just wasn't immediately obvious to anybody. But the reason I pursued that one is because being on ADHD medication, it just removes all of that sort of like mental clutter. And then also like the unmasking. So like masking, for anyone who doesn't know, is this often subconscious behaviors that you do to like camouflage with like people around you. So when you've learned from quite a young age that you shouldn't talk too much, you shouldn't talk too fast, you shouldn't move around, you shouldn't do this, you should do that, it becomes ingrained in you and you don't even think about it. And you think that's quite normal as well, that everybody has to like beat those behaviors out of them, but it's turns out that's not the case. So between the medication and like the unmasking, the autistic traits started to become really obvious. So I was like, well, I do this and everyone else doesn't do that, and this and that and that, and those explicitly just aren't ADHD things. So it turns out that they both mask each other. So like my ADHD makes me quite like extroverted and like a people person and all those sorts of things, whereas like my autism like relies on sort of like structure and routine and like process and everything. So obviously when you have that, somebody's not going to look like ADHD. People have called me super organized, the most organized person they've met for as long as I can remember. So the journey has been ongoing since April 2021, since like my first diagnosis, and I'm still learning things about myself like every single day. And it's also really common for like women and like other marginalized people to have a diagnosis like so late in life because of just people's like assumptions, like the medical models and everything. So that's why I'm also quite vocal about like the experiences of being late diagnosed as well, because it's not kind of, I'm not saying it's better to have it earlier in life, because that can still cause you like challenges, but the different challenges that people experience both in the personal life and in the professional world, when you only found out in your 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s that your brain is not what you thought it is. Surprise.
And was there a sense of relief, I suppose, when you got that first diagnosis? Because like you said, you tried all these different things and it just wasn't working for you. Was there a sense of, oh, okay, it's not me, I'm not doing something wrong?
Yeah, there was a massive like deep breath, and I was like, oh my god, like it just immediately made so much sense. There's also that sort of like periods of grief, because I felt like I didn't actually struggle academically. I did really well in my GCSEs. I got 4 A stars and 6 A's, which I know it's a different scale now. Don't even ask me what that is in today's grading system. But that's what it was back in my day. And I feel really old saying that now. So that was fine. And it was really easy. But it was when it came to like A levels and like university, is like the academic achievement was still there, but it came at like a cost. I left my dissertation until like the last 2 weeks to write it. And I can tell you now, like I've never been in that state since, the state that I was in sort of like those 2 weeks. So I did experience a bit of that grief of that. Like I could have got the support, I could have been on like the medication, I could have got adjustments for like being in lectures, because I never attended lectures because I found them like super boring. I just watched them and catch up on like 1.5 times speed, which again, looking back now makes a lot of sense. Like everything's, you just like, yep, when you just remember it. So I was like, okay, great. So then I got to work just trying to understand my ADHD and how to work with it. My autism diagnosis, like that experience was actually quite different. So I actually cried after that. It took a few days for it to all sort of like sink in. I didn't cry after my ADHD diagnosis. I was like, oh, that's like a bit frustrating, but you know, let's get on with it now. I think the autism diagnosis just cut a little bit deeper, because it explained the challenges which I'd had with like relationships and like friendships, and looking at people who are still friends with like their friends from school, and like I didn't really like have any of that. It was my autism which made me like constantly like misunderstood by people when I had like good intentions, and being called like controlling, ruining the fun, not letting people get like the last word in, always wanting to be right, like all of those sorts of things. And those are like really personal. Like the academic like impact from ADHD, like it just didn't really come close to that.
Yeah, no, that's understandable. And that feeling of I've been misunderstood all this time. Yeah. And so you had your first diagnosis when you were still in the workplace, right? And your second one after you'd left and set up on your own, is that right?
Yeah, so technically, I was still working in November last year, and I sent the request to my GP again for a referral, but I wasn't in a position to pay for a private diagnosis. So I didn't know how long I was going to have to wait for an NHS diagnosis. And we know the lists are really long. So I actually self-diagnosed in November, which is something that a lot of people aren't comfortable doing, and we'll talk about that maybe a little bit more when we talk about like the workplace and stuff. But so I did talk about it like publicly, sort of like from November, because I sort of like knew, but it was coming towards the end of my time in like the workplace. So I would say there was a lot of change happening in quite a short period of time.
And what led you to make that leap then? What led you to leave the workplace and set up Parallel Minds?
So I decided to leave my last job and just take like a few months off just to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. Like for the past almost 6 years, I'd never really had more than like a week off. And sometimes you come back and you feel more exhausted than before you went off. I'm sure you probably know the feeling. I think I knew deep down that this is what I wanted to do. I was doing a lot of stuff internally with my last company. I was delivering some sessions on a freelance basis to some clients while working. But I wanted to make sure that I wasn't doing it just because I didn't want to go back into the workplace, that I wanted to do it for like all of the right reasons. And I figured that even personally for me, if I went into another permanent job, like I think it would be really unfair to me and for them, because I don't think I would have lasted like a year at that point. So it was like both of those angles, that like it was for me like personally and like what I needed for like my environment and like my mission, but then also to be able to achieve the things that like we're trying to achieve like collectively as like an industry. And it was also pretty wild to me. I've looked really hard, so they might exist, but I've really struggled to find any other neurodiversity consultancy that specializes in the tech sector.
Okay.
Which came as a surprise to me.
Yeah.
So there are some people who do like ADHD coaching and stuff that have worked in tech or specialize in working with like tech clients, but nobody who provides wider consultancy working in the tech sector who also has a background in like tech as well. So that was like, I was like, if I don't do it now, like somebody else is going to do it.
Yeah. Well, perfect timing then. And so let's get a few, if you're happy to do this right from the off, let's get a few definitions out there for people, right? Because I know definitely when I was pulling the questions together for you, I was tripping over my own language, right, as I was writing these, and like, oh, what's the difference? Am I writing neurodiversity, or I should write neurodivergent, and what's right and what's wrong? And I know you very kind to correct me on a couple of those. So are you happy to share a few definitions? So before we start, sharing them throughout the course of this conversation, so people are sort of starting off on the right foot, between things like neurodiversity versus neurodivergent, what the difference is there, and neurotypical versus neuronormative. Like what are the differences?
Yeah, I guess before I say that, I think it's like completely understandable for like I got mixed up like quite a lot in like the beginning, and like there is no harm in, you know, maybe sort of like mixing things up. Also, it would be quite hypocritical considering like, you know, dyslexic people are like neurodivergent, and it might be easier for them, it might be more difficult for them to just make sure that it is sort of like the right word. So like I always make sure that I do it really respectfully, and like sometimes there's sort of like no harm done. But as starting off, so neurodiversity just refers to the infinite variations of neurocognitive thinking in the human mind. So basically how we think and how we function, basically. Okay. So similarly, like biodiversity refers to the diversity of like an ecological environment. I know obviously some of the people watching this are working in like climate tech, so they might be a little bit like familiar with that. Yeah, very, very apt. Do you know what? I didn't even think about that, because that's the one which I always use, because people can always kind of connect the dots that way. That's also something which I'm really good at, is like using like metaphors and stuff, so that it like solidifies it in people's brains, which I'll talk about a bit later. So like just the way that we need biodiversity for like a healthy ecological environment, we need neurodiversity for like a healthy society and a workplace. Nice. So within that, we obviously have like neurodivergent people, which will be people like me. So that's it covers quite a lot of things. So people think ADHD, autism, dyslexia, but there are quite a lot more like under that, and a lot that people haven't actually heard of. So I might not mention too many of them like detail to not like overwhelm people, but just to make you aware that like they exist. So like dyscalculia, so people describe it as dyslexia but with like numbers, dyspraxia, which affects like motor coordination and perception of things in space, basically. Misophonia, which one of my clients has misophonia, and that is having quite a strong emotional reaction to sounds that like humans make. So like most obvious one is people like chewing, and obviously like we all hate that like a little bit, but it's quite a strong response. But even just other sounds, and yeah, there's many more, and it does also cover like mental health conditions, and also like personality disorders, so like BPD and like bipolar as well, which a lot of people don't know. Obviously the opposite of that would be someone who doesn't have one of those, and that would be like a neurotypical. And where neuronormativity fits into this, and I think this is quite an important concept for people to get their heads around when we talk about neurodiversity in like the workplace, because everything that we talk about is centered around that. So neuronormativity is this social construct that there is a proper way to behave and function. So that's like making the right amount of eye contact, non-verbal like communication, so like body language, active listening. So people assume just because you're not looking, or you maybe get distracted, that like you're not listening. Emotional regulation is that like you should be able to regulate your emotions to like this level, because like everybody else can do that, and like it's not appropriate, but it's just not possible for some people. So all of these like standards and like expectations, and because neurodivergent people don't align with those, that's what makes them neurodivergent. And people aligning with those things is what makes people like neurotypical. So there is quite a lot to unpack with like neuronormativity, and I will link something if people want to read in like a little bit more detail about it, which you can pop in maybe like the podcast description.
Yeah, that's fascinating. As you're saying that, I'm just thinking back as a recruiter to all these times when interview feedback about people not making the right amount of eye contact, or all of these things come up, and that is, from their perspective, somebody not interviewing well, but massively neuronormative, right? That's holding someone to a certain expectation that isn't necessarily fair.
Yeah, or just not making. I as an internal recruiter, like particularly, like I really had to challenge some of my interviewers' feedback. I had one who had put generally good feedback, and then has put like didn't have good crack, as in CRAIC. So that's like banter for people who like don't know. Think it's quite like an Irish word. And I was like, okay, what bearing does that have on like their capability? And they didn't really have a response to it. So I was like, okay, we can take that out then. Obviously, I didn't say it as sort of like bluntly. It was an educational like conversation around why that's not even appropriate to like put in there, but also like recognize where your own biases come from, and because they were from a different cultural background as well. So they might not have even been neurodivergent. Like I'm from India, and my dad, ironically, is who I got my autism from. So bit of a double whammy. Like he really struggles to understand like the dry British humour. Like, I don't know when people are like joking. Like I don't understand like the sarcasm. I don't know when somebody's being like mean by sort of like being nice, and he just doesn't really get it. So that's why like it's, when we talk about this, it is actually just a little bit bigger than that. Like these norms are also like Western norms.
Yes. Yeah. You're right. There is so much to unpack. Yeah. And so why is it important? I mean, I think most people are kind of on board with this, but why is it so important for us to be talking about and learning about neurodiversity in the workplace?
I suppose the first thing is that this isn't in preparation for, diversifying our workforce and like bringing neurodivergent people in, because they are already there. Like they exist. More people are getting diagnosed like by the day, and like as they should, because people like me are being undiagnosed and going so long, like sort of like without the support. So it's not really going anywhere. And I think because it's quite new in the DEI conversation, of course, I remember being exposed to the whole sort of movement around like women in tech at the very start of like my career, and we absolutely still have like a lot of work to do there. So I'm not saying that don't focus on that, focus on this, because it's not sort of like either or. And as we know, there is some overlap there, and it's important that we talk about it because people don't necessarily quite like understand it. And I get that, because there's a lot of sort of like conflicting information. There's a lot of sort of conflicting advice. We are unfortunately victim to our own sort of biases and assumptions as well, even as neurodivergent people. So we call that internalized ableism. So when if you have ADHD, and obviously I've known for a while and have a lot of the systems and stuff, it's not that I don't struggle, but an example of internalized ableism would be if I look at somebody, I'm like, I just don't understand why you can't do that on time. Just so I can do it, why I can't. No, if I can get my head around it, you can do it. And it's the expectation that people should be able to do things that you can do. So that's why it's not about a neurodivergent, neurotypical divide. It's actually everybody coming together. Yeah. And because those people are in your workplace and they do have, some excel in sort of some areas, but maybe sort of struggle in some, if you're a founder of a startup or a scale up or a manager, it's in your best interest to learn about it, because those people aren't really going anywhere. And the organizations, and there's so many case studies who have the proper policies and processes and the right sort of support in place, they're reporting better business outcomes, better revenue, outperforming their competitors, improved retention, improved company brand. The benefits go on and on. So if you're not thinking about it now, maybe it's time.
And so, as you said, this isn't about bringing more neurodivergent people into your business. Like you said, they're already there. You just maybe don't know. And one stat I read in some of your work that I thought was amazing was you said that 53% of people in technology identify as neurodivergent, but only 3% disclose this to their employers. So, I mean, that astounded me. I mean, first of all, talk to us about why there is this lack of disclosure, and perhaps why is it that these organisations are creating an environment? What are they getting so wrong that is stopping people from feeling like they can disclose?
Yeah, there's a lot of reasons why people don't disclose. One of them, which has I don't have a stat for it, but it's come up quite a lot anecdotally, is that people don't want to disclose either in the recruitment process or they have onboarding forms, and it's is there anything that you want to share with us? And you need to put anxiety, depression, ADHD, whatever it is. But then it's and then they start, and then it's 6 months, 12 months, 2 years, and it's okay, but when? It just doesn't feel like the right time. In what context would this situation happen? And then what happens as a result of that is, if that conversation does happen, it's because it's reactive, because that person's having performance issues, and maybe they've been put on a PIP, or they maybe put in a grievance, just anything like that. So it's that in between time, when do you actually sort of encourage that happening? There's a neurodiversity in tech report, which sort of assess the reasons why people don't disclose. 55% of them said because of lack of diagnosis. So as mentioned earlier, I needed to self-diagnose as autistic because I just needed to accept it myself and tell other people yes, I got a medical diagnosis, but that didn't change that I was autistic before. I'm autistic now, and I probably will be for the rest of my life. But people, unfortunately, don't. They're scared of telling people because they feel not having the validation for a medical professional is actually quite difficult. And we know if you're in the UK, your employees are in the UK, the wait list for NHS are actually really, really long. So overcoming that is, it's quite difficult to convince people that you don't need a medical diagnosis, but you can support people with getting one. So I've spoken to people who, through their private healthcare providers, actually cover a diagnosis.
Okay,
which is great. So I've got Vitality. They don't do any of those things. They're just you can have a free Itsu, but none of the other stuff. So they're good with the perks, less with the medical stuff. But there are healthcare providers out there who pay for it. I know somebody he owns a recruitment company. They actually pay for it themselves because they know that they've got some neurodivergent people. And now I know the people who are listening to this, you might be bootstrapped, you might be obviously having to answer to investors, all those sorts of things. So in an ideal world, yes, we'd love to pay for people to get diagnosed, but maybe maybe doing it on like an ad hoc basis, if like instead of being like, we need to put this person on a PIP, maybe it's like, okay, do you think you might have ADHD? Because like we can pay for you to go for like an assessment. And it's not going to be like a one size fits all. But that's something which a lot of people don't think would actually be like a really, really big help, because it can be quite expensive for an individual.
Yeah, absolutely. And what are some things that you mentioned there? You've got this form at the very beginning of the process. Is there anything you want to tell us? And then absolutely nothing until you're struggling. And now we're talking about it.
Yeah.
In your advice, I mean, what could an organization put in between those two times to create really open dialogue and a psychologically safe space in which someone feels confident to disclose, even if it's a self-diagnosis other than a medical diagnosis?
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you something which doesn't work. So somebody who is a technical leader at quite a big telecoms company, and they wanted to do some stuff around like neurodiversity and things, and then they put out this sort of like self-identification like survey and stuff like that, and basically nobody came back and like said anything. And what went wrong there is that first of all, it just feels like a tick box exercise, which we sort of like talk about quite a lot, but it's literally a tick box exercise. There's nothing to suggest to them. I said, well, have you explained to people what the benefit would be of letting them know, like, what's the process? What happens after that? Like, does it trigger sort of like a safe conversation with like your manager? Are you going to get called into like HR? Nobody knows. They're like, what's the point in this? So like, I'm not going to say anything. But if you'd have framed it as the reason we want to know about this, and we're not going to ask for medical evidence, by the way, is that we obviously some people have some experiences and we want to be able to support people. If you do decide to disclose this to us, we will encourage your manager to have a conversation with you. They have also received training on to how to navigate this conversation sensitively to be able to support you. And if you wish, we can either look into a workplace needs assessment, putting some accommodations in place, and also we won't tell anybody else like without your permission. So see the difference between that and do you have something you want to tell us? Which one would you feel more comfortable sharing something so personal with? I'm going to go with the latter.
And as you said, within the neurodivergent community, there are so many different conditions that fall under that umbrella. Each person with each one of those conditions is going to be manifest in very different ways to somebody else. Everything within that is within a spectrum. So actually, just because somebody has a label on them, the needs and the accommodations, I appreciate might not be the right word to use, and we'll come to that in a minute, that you would make as an organization for that person are going to be very different to another person with ADHD in the organization. So actually maybe a better way of doing it is just to be inclusive in how you manage people and how people are looked after from the outset with everyone, whether it's because of a diagnosis or a condition, or just because you do it for everybody. How do you need to be managed? How do you need to be supported? What tools and mechanisms can we put in place so that you do the best job possible? And I mean, startups are particularly challenging for this, right? Because, and like we already said, most of the people watching this will be startup founders. Startups by their very nature are environments of constant change, constant ambiguity, things are moving all of the time. And those are two things that can be really, really challenging for people with autism. But they're going to need to build tech teams. If they're a tech startup, they're going to need to build a tech team. And a number of those people are probably going to be autistic potentially. So how can you work within those bounds? How can you create an environment where you've got, well, this is the reality of what a startup is, but we also want to make this a place people can thrive?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because there is that sort of like generalization that like autistic people like really struggle with change. But just because of maybe again the reliance on like predictability and all of those sorts of things. I remember one time, and this was the thing where I was like definitely autistic. I sat on the dining table and like my boyfriend was cooking in the kitchen. I was making like a stir fry, and I saw him pull out the paprika from the spice cupboard and go to put it in the stir fry. And I was like, "What are you doing?" And he looks at me like, "What?" I said, "You don't put paprika in a stir fry. That's not the thing." Do you know what I mean? And he was like, "Stop micromanaging me while I'm trying to cook." And I was like, "But it's not right." Do you know what I mean? So it's yes, that is again just like a little bit of like a stereotype, but it's just because it didn't make logical sense like in my brain. And a lot of that comes from like the autistic need of like needing to know like the why. So it's not that people, autistic people and other neurodivergent people maybe like struggling to kind of like navigate like the change, because it's a part of life, but it's when things are always happening like behind like closed doors and you don't really understand how it fits within like the wider picture. Like, why are we pivoting this sort of like strategy? Why are we only being told like now? Like, what are the implications like of this? How are we going to sort of like adapt to the change as like a team? So rapid change is inevitable for like startups, but the environment might be like really, really good with those people. So just like recognizing that like people might just need like a little bit more sort of like context. And if you don't give it, if they ask for like the context, don't perceive it as them like questioning your judgment. Like, that's a real problem, is when you're just like just want to understand the why again, because sometimes I can't do something just because somebody has told me to do it. It's like the grown-up version. Like, were you ever told as a child from an adult, well, because I said so, and like I'm the adult, and you weren't given a good enough reason for it? Well, that's a great way to make sure that your kids don't develop emotional intelligence. But like from an adult perspective, like we are adults, like if you feel like everything is going on like behind closed doors and people don't really understand like what's going on, just think how a little bit more like transparency might help people, and not just neurodivergent people, but like everybody.
And actually, surely that's just a really great way of running a business anyway, right? Because even if you don't know that you have anybody that would identify as neurodivergent in your organization, A, chances are you probably do, you just don't know it. And B, it challenges that concept of neuronormativity, that actually we should operate with this transparency and this level of bringing people into the loop and explaining the context, rather than just do it because I said so. And is there a point where, because I think sometimes in the work, and I talked about this in a previous episode actually, when companies are trying to make sure that they are driving up the diversity within their business, right, and they are trying to create a really inclusive workplace, I think there can be a tendency for companies to try to be something for everyone. And that's both a good and a bad thing, right? Is there a point at which we draw a line where we just say, actually, this is our environment, this is who we are, and actually that may not suit some people or not? What do you think?
That is so interesting. And I'm really glad you asked it, because it's something people are scared of even thinking or like asking about, because they're like, well, I don't want to seem like I'm like discriminating or something. But like there's two sides to it. There is this not working for that person because the environment is just not, it just doesn't have like optimal conditions, which we know that conditions can always be like adjusted usually. Or is this just really not like the right job like for them? Like, let's say, like for example, if there was a like a copywriter job, and somebody was gonna, and let's say for argument's sake, Grammarly doesn't exist, but it does exist. So like 20 years ago, and a dyslexic person like really wanted to do this job because they like love this, but like they just couldn't get past some of like the grammatical and sort of like spelling mistakes and stuff, and it was making more work sort of like for like the team and things. And if you didn't have the tech to help you, like there is a point where you maybe like draw the line. But what I'm asking people to think about is like, where does that line currently sit for you? Like, is it too far down that like you're just jumping straight to the assumption that like this person isn't right for the company, or they're not capable of like this job? Or have you considered like the other things that could really make it like work for them, that could just be small changes? And I guess another part, which is maybe quite relevant for like startups as well, is everyone does everything, which is fine, and it might sort of like really work well for like a lot of people, and it's just the nature of like the beast. But if there's just one specific thing which people might really struggle with, is there maybe like a bit of like task swapping or like responsibility swapping. It's basically called like job carving, and you can do this right from the beginning of the recruitment process. I know Manchester City Council are starting to do that with sort of like some of like their jobs, which is interesting. But like, for example, as like a recruiter, I was really good at like all of like the other stuff. But when I had to put the jobs through our applicant tracking system, and there were like all of the fields and then the different jobs for like different locations, and I had to change like the thing. And no matter how many times I checked it over, there'd always be a mistake. And then I would literally spend the full day doing it, going back and forth, doing other things. And then my manager messaged me and be like, why aren't the jobs like live? Like, we need like applications. And I'm like, I'm so sorry, I'm still doing it, because I didn't want to like voice that like I'm spiraling because I can't see what's wrong, but I know there is, because there always is. But imagine in that situation, if there's somebody else in the team who is really good at those sorts of things, and I just say, right, I've put it, can you just have a look through it? Because Grammarly ain't going to help me with that, because it's specific stuff. And then if there's something which like they wanted me to do, maybe do some of the candidate interviews in exchange, I would happily do that. And can you see how that would be like a win-win situation? And that doesn't have to be like a formal written HR like reasonable adjustment. Like, you can just do that on like a ad hoc basis, depending on people's like interests and strengths and sort of like their availability, because you can't do it all the time. But that's just one thing which you can think about, just doing things a bit differently, and then it means that people might be able to do the jobs.
Yeah. And what are some other tips? I mean, what could companies be doing better? And you speak to a lot of neurodivergent people, right, through the work that you do. What are first of all, what are some of the key challenges and themes that you see come up time and time again with how workplace cultures aren't meeting their needs, first of all? And what are some kind of quick and easy things? Appreciate, well, maybe they won't be quick and easy, and it's fine if they're not. People need to do some work, right? But what could organizations be doing to be more inclusive in their working practices and cultures?
So all of the challenges are quite individual, you know, obviously like individual to sort of like that person. But in terms of like the common themes, we've already talked about not feeling comfortable disclosing. And then as a result, they don't feel comfortable asking for like accommodations. Technically and legally, you can ask for accommodations without disclosing, but people feel a bit weird saying it and just be like, but I don't want to tell you why. So they sort of like go like hand in hand. They're not being able to like get the accommodations means that like they are overcompensating for the stuff that they find 10 times harder, but there might be a solution to reduce or like completely remove that time, like that energy which is being poured into sort of like this other thing. There's a lot of context switching which like happens, and I think in general, like people are, whether you work for a startup, whether you're neurodivergent, whatever, like as a society, and this is just obviously a outcome of like capitalism and stuff, is that people are exhausted. Everybody's having to do so much, juggling so much. The economy is so volatile, like right now, like people are scared of like losing their jobs. And if we like recognize that is happening in everybody, not just neurodivergent people, but there's other people that are potentially like at a high risk of like burnout. And one of the reasons is like self-monitoring. So you remember I was talking to you about like people making like assumptions on like how you speak and like what you do and like how you're sort of like coming across. Self-monitoring is basically like a trauma response of like how you've been like treated and spoken to and like perceived as a result of like your neurodivergent traits and how you've been shamed. So if you're excessively self-monitoring, you are constantly looking out for like, am I making enough eye contact? Did that come across a little bit like blunt? Maybe I should send another message. Am I over communicating? Am I under communicating? Did I do this right? To such an extreme extent that your brain does not have capacity for like anything else. People really struggle like navigating internal like politics, which like let's not deny like they absolutely exist. There's a lot of unspoken and unwritten rules in like the workplace. So like the last company was a startup which had at most 8 people. Then I went to a company which was over 200 people, which grew to about 500 in like a year and a bit. So it was like massive growth. And there were just things which I didn't know, like what's the right way to like message like somebody on Slack. I didn't know that you shouldn't keep sending. So when I WhatsApp people, I put message send, you know, like you just have thoughts. And then I got told that like not to do that because it keeps pinging people. I was like, right, okay. So that can also be like really challenging. Meetings are hard for like everybody, but if you have to sit through meetings that are really long, where you're not participating, where you're shown slides with like loads of information expected to absorb it, you're made to sort of like put your camera on, so you're just like staring at a screen and worried about, do I look like I'm paying enough like attention? Like that's really exhausting, and you need like an hour or so to like recover from it. So like I suppose those are some of like the challenges which people face, and I really couldn't do them justice, but the important thing is that a lot of these are like invisible struggles because we don't want to be vulnerable and say that like I'm really struggling, like something's wrong, particularly in leaders, because there's an expectation that managers have it. They have it down, they have it sorted. Do you know what I mean? Like, I've got to look after the team, I've got to look after like the project. So like the managers are also quite important in this conversation. I'm not talking about like junior and like mid people as well. Everybody is experiencing these things.
That's so interesting. And I'm sort of likening it into my mind to when you start a new job, right? You know, when you start a new job, you start in a new company and you feel completely fish out of water to start off with.
Yeah.
Because you know how to do the job, but all of that extra mental bandwidth and mental load that you have to take on around, well, what's the right way to operate here? What are the cultural norms? Who do I go to for this? I don't even know how the phone system works. That's the stuff that exhausts you. And that's why for the first fortnight of starting a new job, you come home and go to bed at 7 o'clock every night, because it's that mental exhaustion. And I can imagine from what you're saying there, that sounds like that's just day-to-day life often in a workplace as somebody that identifies as neurodivergent. Is there's this layer of cognitive overload that's going on constantly, right?
That, I think that's a really good way to like describe it. And there's a misconception that like neurodivergent people just take in that information like slower, and they're just slower to sort of like process because maybe like not taking in like enough at a time. But actually the opposite is true. And this stat is for autistic people, but I think it definitely applies to others, that research has shown that autistic minds process upwards of 42% more information at rest compared to non-autistic people. So that's where, so for example, for me, and this is important when you're thinking about office space, is I really struggle with like sensory overload. So like I can go to like a concert or a movie fine if it's that's like loud, but when I'm in a space where there's so many overlapping like noises, something's beeping in the background, somebody's typing to the left, someone's typing to the right, someone's on the phone there, microwave doors going, like all of those sounds are just like akin to like, you might as well just peel my skin off, basically. That's actually what it feels like. It's so uncomfortable. And I've been in situations where I've actually gotten like really irritable and like angry for like no reason, and just sort of like lashed out. So again, I know we can't go in sort of like too much detail, but like being neuro-inclusive is also thinking about sort of like the physical space and how it's set up for like people as well, because if you do spend some time in the office, that makes a really big difference. But again, the processing stat makes a lot of sense, because it's like I am absorbing that at such a higher rate than like everybody else. And then if you apply that to sort of like the workplace, is let people have time to process the information. So I was speaking to somebody who we're doing some like one-to-one coaching, and she's in like a leadership role, and she said one of the problems is, so it's a very fast-paced company, by the way, they're like startup scale up sort of like size, and she said one of her problems is that people give her loads of information and expect her to process it and make a decision on it right there and then, and she does not have the firstly impulsivity. So you'll just do it. You won't even let yourself like think about it, but it's not always like the right decision because you haven't sort of like processed it. Similarly, if you're catching up with somebody, you're like, oh, like how did you find that like workshop? How did you find that call? Like how's this, how's that? Like the chances are the response that you get then is probably not going to be like the honest one. Like give people information and allow them to feed back to you in like their own time. Another example is when you're doing group brainstorming sessions or like workshops and stuff, and people obviously love a good Miro board. I love a Miro board, use it for all my talks and stuff. But the amount of times that people will expect everybody to look at like the whole board and there's so much going on, and you're like, what the heck is this? And they're like, okay, I'm gonna like move it around, and could you add sticky notes on that? And you're like, I've literally, my brain's gone completely like blank right now. So just one example, which is so easy. Obviously, we talk about meeting agendas and stuff, but like the whiteboards are sometimes even more difficult. So like just share it with people and say, if you want to add some sticky notes beforehand, there's some notes on what we're looking for you to add beforehand. And additionally, let people add things after meetings. Because there's nothing worse than feeling like you're not a contributing member of like a team, because people keep discussing things on like team meetings and stuff comes to you afterwards and you just feel really embarrassed about it. Say like, Fab, yeah, we've talked about this today. We'll leave the Google Doc open if you want to add some of your own thoughts and in like your own time. And these are just a few of the many examples of things that like, you don't need somebody to disclose. You don't need them to ask for accommodations and stuff. Like, just do it for everybody, because it's also going to benefit people who, like, for example, are not native English speakers or have social anxiety. Like, it's for this is what we call universal accessibility. So, I mean, which like everybody will know, closed captions. Like, do you put captions on when you watch TV and movies? I won't watch them without them.
Same. Yeah, I cannot watch the television without captions anymore. Yeah.
Exactly. And did you know, so one of the people who was sort of like part of that like movement also recommends people looking into the history of the disability rights movements. Lots of because it forms all of this anyway. So the moon landing. So there was a recent graduate who was watching the moon landing in was it 1969, and he was deaf, and he was like and obviously couldn't follow like any of it along. And I think one of the quotes from him was that he saw real irony in the fact that we have the technology to send a human to the moon, but we can't have captions to make it accessible for the large number of like deaf people on the planet. And he wasn't one of sort of like the only people, because there were a lot of people sort of like involved in like that movement. But you can just see that's such a clear example of like doing something for like one group is a necessity. So people who are deaf physically cannot interpret what somebody's saying in a movie without it. But for some of the rest of us, we still benefit, but it's a little bit more of like a comfort thing. And that's why it's good to do it for like everybody, but recognizing that like, okay, it's nice for you, but for the people, this is a lifeline. This is a make or break of whether they're able to do their job, whether they're able to look after themselves and perform to like the best of their ability.
And like you said, design that culture to be universally accessible from the outset, right? So it's great for everybody, whether you're neurodivergent or not, because it'll benefit us all. Absolutely. And what are some of the, I mean, if there are people out there that are listening to this that are neurodivergent or suspect that they might be, what are some of the, and potentially are struggling in their workplace, what are some of the coping mechanisms and toolkits that you've got in place that help you perform at your best and help you manage that roller coaster of extremes? I mean, you've already showed me a lovely timer.
Yes. So I mean, I've just seen like my time is sort of going down. So here, this is a little visual timer. And as I spin it, it is for children, but I don't really care. I like the rainbow. So I can physically see the passage of time. So like when I'm like, I just want to time box something and I get hyperfixated, I get lost in the source, it makes me like, because I can't not see it in front of me. And people are like, but you have a clock, but you can set timers, you can do all those sorts of things. Don't work, because I just won't look at them. If it's not right in front of me, it's not really going to help. And there's other sort of like physical things, but one of the biggest helpers for me is technology. And we live in a day and age where there is a tool for pretty much everything, and there are so many which are free or they are quite like affordable. So I use Reclaim AI, which is AI calendar management. It slots in like focus time, different recurring habits, and it moves them and shortens them depending on what else is going on, so I don't have to think about it. It adds decompression time after like meetings, like that's absolutely amazing. I use meeting transcription software, which I can also use one of like my credits to generate an AI meeting summary as well with like action points. So that helps me when I'm doing like meetings or really important calls, because I can't listen, think about what I'm going to say and take notes all at the same time. There's also a free tool called Goblin Tools, which has a collection of resources. I know it sounds crazy, totally free. The app you have to pay like 60p for, but there's a magic to do. So it breaks down your task into smaller tasks, depending on the level of spiciness. So if you're like, I need extreme breaking down, like total step-by-step walk me through it. And then there's one which is great, and I call this my neurotypical neurodivergent translator within Goblin Tools, and it's called the Formalizer. So I use this in conjunction with like ChatGPT. So basically, if you're like, I've written this, but it just doesn't sound right. I need it to be a bit more formal, or I need to like condense it, make it more to the point, or I need to make it more sarcastic. I don't know in what context you would need that. It does all of that, and it's so good. And then the other side is it also has a judge thing. So if I get an email, I'm like, that's giving me weird vibes, that feels passive aggressive, I paste it into there and I ask it to judge it. And it sometimes says that like, no, this is absolutely fine, you're reading into it too much. I'm like, okay, fair enough. And then sometimes it's like, yeah, so this specific thing is giving this tone like a little bit, though overall it's quite balanced. I'm like, this is brilliant. So I mean, those are just like 3 examples, but there's so much stuff like out there. Don't over-engineer it, and maybe don't jump to adding everything that like once, but explore what you have, because if it's free, like you can just get it. You don't have to disclose. You don't have to ask your employer to sort of like pay for it. And I will also get you to link my Notion resource bank, which within that I've got collections, there's guides, there's reports, there's research, but I've also got one for like tools. So all of the different stuff which I use and other people use, you can see like everything on there. And when you see like a direct report struggling as a manager, or just as somebody else as like a peer, just think like, is there something which we can utilize, either as like bringing something new in or using something which we already have like a little bit better? Like how many devs hate using like Jira and all of those sorts of things? Like, is there a way to automate some stuff, like make templates, like reduce the manual effort and like the manual like load? And that's one thing which I'm great at as an ADHD, because I hate inefficiencies. Like if there is a better and a quicker way to do it, I will find a way to do it. And I can guarantee you there's a lot of processes within companies that are wasting a lot of people's times, and there's just a different way just to use your existing tools differently to save time.
Yeah.
And people's mental health as well.
Absolutely. I love that. Thank you. We will definitely link to that resource bank, because it's a brilliant tool for people to use. And if people want to get in touch with you, Parul, following this, how can they do so? Where can we find you?
I will put my my LinkedIn profile. So yeah, if you want to send me a message on LinkedIn, I send me a request, but I also have an open inbox, so non-connections can get in touch as well. If you don't have LinkedIn, I will also pop my email address. And also my website, which please don't judge, I definitely need to do. It's basically just a contact form right now, but you can also use that one.
Perfect. That's amazing. Well, Parul, thank you so much for your time. And, you know, just to say as a footnote to all of this, I think I've been following you since about 2021. I think you first came into my, just an anecdote, you might not find this funny, but it's meant to be, right? You first came onto my radar because you called me out on something I wrote on LinkedIn. But then, you did. You totally called me out. It was about disclosing salary, right? You called me out on it, so rightly so, that it really made me reframe and rethink how I thought about that entire topic. So first of all, thank you for that. But then put you on my radar. I was like, who is this girl? So I started following you, and I've been such a supporter from the sidelines.
Thank you so much.
Journey. I followed your whole journey from leaving the agency to your work with the consultancy to your diagnosis. And yeah, honestly, I'm such a big supporter of what you do in the industry. I really am.
Thank you so much. And I didn't even realize that that was our sort of like first like interaction. So I hope that I didn't come off as sort of like direct.
You know, it was one of those moments where I was like, oh, how dare she? Oh God. Oh no, she's totally right. No, I'm totally wrong. I need to rethink this. And I love those moments though. Those moments are important, right? Because
absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. There you go. So thank you for it, is what I'm saying.
Thank you so much.
But also thank you for spending some time today to share what is, I know, very personal to you, and hopefully will be helpful not only to the founders listening today, who hopefully will now build much more inclusive, universally accessible workplaces for everybody, but also for people listening who, you know, might be on their own journey to diagnosis. So thank you so much. And thank you everybody for listening.